Hello friends, today we shall discuss and try to analyze Preface to Lyrical Ballads written by William Wordsworth. As this is the part of your syllabus of paper second, that is the critical theory of MA Final English Literature. I think you remember that we have completed Aristotle's Poetics and we also did Natya Shastra written by Bharata Muni. Now we shall begin with William Wordsworth. So far the critical theory is concerned, William Wordsworth has also written about the poetry, about the language of poetry, as well as about the poet. So he has expressed his views regarding poetry in his preface that was written for Lyrical Ballads. We know that the Lyrical Ballads is an important collection of Wordsworth as well as of Coleridge. Both of them have incorporated their choices, their poems. So this is one of the best collection of the poems that was published in 1802. So the preface has been written to the Lyrical Ballads, and this preface is in fact an essay which gives us an idea of poetry or the views on poetry by William Wordsworth. And this preface, published in January 1801, and then it is also referred to as the 1800 edition of the poetry collection, that is the Lyrical Ballads. Then greatly this preface was expanded in the third edition of 1802. So this preface is now seen as a de facto manifesto of the Romantic movement. I not only hope but sure that you all have read about William Wordsworth very well. You have read the poems he has written. I think you have read The Solitary Reaper, The World is Too Much With Us, Tinton Abbey, and She Was a Phantom of Delight, and the other poems just like the Prelude. I think the Prelude should be in your MA previous syllabus, and you might have read it. So you know about Wordsworth's views as well as Wordsworth's direction, Wordsworth's poetry, to which trend he belongs. And we know that he belongs to the Romantic revival that took place in literature, English literature. And we know what about the Romantic revival is. And you should also know it that Wordsworth is known as the father of Romantic revival. So this preface, which was written to the Lyrical Ballads, is seen as a de facto manifesto. That is, the things are there, but which does not have any legal documents. It means whatever the poet says is there, but there is no any proof or any legal documents in order to prove that thing. We are here concerned with the definition of poetry that Wordsworth has given, and he has also explained the difference between poetry and prose. So, in our today's lecture, we will see what he has said about poetry in his preface. And in our next lecture, we will discuss something more that he has said in preface. As well, we shall also go with some important quotations that I have chosen from the preface. I think you should get the copy of the preface either from you can download from the Google, from the net, and you can also get it from the market. So try to go with the original language writing of the preface. Here I am just discussing the important points which are there. Okay? So the 4 guidelines of the manifesto includes. So the romantic revival, as I have said. So what is the romantic revival? What about this romantic revival? There are certain things which are the important features or can be considered as the characteristics of the romantic revival. That romantic poetry is the subjective poetry. That the romantic poets were the poets of nature. They were the lover of the nature. They describes the nature, gives the vivid depiction of nature in their poetry, and they enjoy the nature. So they have moved the literary train towards the nature or towards the poetry which can satisfy you as well as the readers. So they have written the subjective poetry also. Sensibility is another feature of the romantic movement. The beauty is also the another feature of romantic movement. Sensuousness is also one of the most important aspect of romantic poetry. So far Wordsworth is concerned, Wordsworth is an ardent lover of nature. So let's see what he says and what is there in that manifesto. That is, ordinary life is the best subject for poetry. And this is what we see in Wordsworth, because Wordsworth uses common man's language. So ordinary life is the best subject. So the theme, the subject, the topic, विषय वस्तु जिसको आप कहते हैं, according to Wordsworth, ordinary life is the best one. So far language is concerned, Wordsworth recommends everyday language which is best suited for poetry. And the third one, expression of feeling is more important than action or plot. Expression of feeling, this is subjective. What you express, how you express your feelings, what are your feelings regarding the particular thing. So this is the subjective point of you can find in poetry. And then Wordsworth also says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion. This is one of the best and all over recognized and recommended and regarded and respected natural definition of poetry that William Wordsworth has given to us. And what is this? Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions. इमोशंस का ओवरफ्लो, लगातार ओवरफ्लो, इमोशंस का स्पॉन्टेनियस ओवरफ्लो पोइट्री है. और वो कौन से इमोशंस? द इमोशंस विच वर रिकलेक्टेड इन ट्रैंक्विलिटी. जो कि ट्रैंक्विलिटी का मतलब है व्हेन वी आर इन पीस, व्हेन वी आर अलोन. उस समय जो हमारे इमोशंस आते हैं, हमारी फीलिंग्स आती हैं, उन फीलिंग्स का जो रिकलेक्शन है, उन इमोशंस का जो रिकलेक्शन है, और वो भी स्पॉन्टेनियस ओवरफ्लो, उन इमोशंस का जो है उसको जब हम रिकलेक्ट करते हैं तो वो जो है कि पोएट्री है, और उसको हम वर्ड्स में फिर लिखते हैं. सो पोएट्री इज द स्पॉन्टेनियस ओवरफ्लो ऑफ इमोशन दैट takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. तो कहीं भी जैसे घूमने गए, आप जो है नेचर का एंजॉय किया, और बाद में जब आप शांति से अपने घर पे हैं, उन सब चीज़ों को आप याद कर रहे हैं, इट मीन्स नाउ यू आर रिकलेक्टिंग दोज एक्सपीरियंसेस, दोज इमोशंस, एंड यू आर ग्रेटिफाइंग योर सेल्फ. वो जो मेमोरीज हैं वो हमें बहुत ही आनंद प्रदान करती है. एंड दिस इज द पोएट्री विलियम वर्ड्सवर्थ सेज. लेट्स सी what is there in the preface. So in fact these four things were the common thing or common characteristics regarding the romantic poetry. Now what we says, Wordsworth says in the preface that poetry as the language of common people. So poetry as the language of common people. It should not be, the poetry should not be that one which cannot be the language of common people, or which can only which can be the language of only few people or few intellectuals. That cannot be a good poetry according to Wordsworth. He presents an explanation for the new type of poetry that he published in 1798. Or 1798 में you know that the lyrical ballads was published. He continued to revise the preface in the hope of gaining a larger reading audience and further recognition by other writers. So he always revised the preface so that the larger reading audience can be attracted to read that collection of poetry. Because poetry is the language of the common people. So he revised this preface so that the larger people, larger audience can read through that, and then it can also get an recognition. Wordsworth rejects previous conventional approaches to literature. Previous conventional approaches. It means the approaches which were before the Romantic Revival. जो Romantic Revival that took place in 1770, उससे पहले की जो poetry थी, that was the conventional poetry, that was the neoclassical poetry, in which the wisdom and the intellect of the poetry was seen. The poetry was not for common people of that time. Wordsworth rejected that idea of traditional or that conventional approach towards the poetry, because he says that poetry that is the neoclassical or classical poetry, which was very heavy and which was emotionally barren. माने जिसमें इमोशन का अभाव था, इमोशन तो थे ही नहीं उसके अंदर, वो तो केवल ज्ञान ही ज्ञान से भरी हुई थी। इसलिए हम उसको वो जो है कि जो अप्रोच है उसको वो रिजेक्ट करता है कि पोइट्री, ए गुड पोइट्री कैन नॉट बी दैट वन। देन ओवरलुकिंग द कनेक्शन ही वैल्यूज बिटवीन द थॉट्स एंड लैंग्वेज ऑफ कॉमन पीपल। और दूसरा फिर किसको वैल्यू करता है वो वैल्यू करता है थॉट्स एंड लैंग्वेज ऑफ कॉमन पीपल। एक तो इमोशंस होने चाहिए पोइट्री में उसके हिसाब से, एक उसमें थॉट्स एंड लैंग्वेज जो कॉमन पीपल क्या होने, कॉमन पीपल क्या सोचता है, कॉमन पीपल कैसे बोलता है, कॉमन पीपल कैसे कन्वर्स करता है, दैट शुड बी द लैंग्वेज अकॉर्डिंग टू वर्ड्सवर्थ। इट शुड नॉट हैव द लैंग्वेज ऑफ द इंटेलेक्चुअल पर्सन्स, क्योंकि इंटेलेक्चुअल पर्सन्स की अगर लैंग्वेज पोइट्री में आएगी तो उसके जो रीडर्स हैं वो कम होंगे, क्योंकि उसको समझ नहीं पाएंगे लोग। अब जब समझ ही नहीं पाएंगे तो नेचुरली अपन जानते हैं कि उसको पढ़ने वाले कम होंगे। आज भी यही है कि जिस चीज़ को जल्दी समझा जा सकता है उसको उसके रीडर्स ज़्यादा होते हैं, उसके ऑडियंस ज़्यादा होते हैं। हम किसी का अगर कोई स्पीच है, अगर उसकी लैंग्वेज ईजी है, हमारे समझ में आ रही है, तो हम उसको एंजॉय करते हैं। लेकिन जैसे हमें लगता है कि उसकी लैंग्वेज डिफ़िकल्ट है, समझ में नहीं आ रही है, चाहे वो कितनी भी अच्छी बात कह रहा हो, तो भी हम उसको डिसलाइक करेंगे, हम उसकी तरफ ध्यान नहीं देंगे कि जाने दो इसको। अगर कोई शशि थरूर को जब सुनता है और जब वो इतनी डिफ़िकल्ट लैंग्वेज में जब अपनी बात रखता है, then it becomes very difficult even for the intellectuals to understand what he says. So here I think we should also accept Wordsworth's view that the poetry should have the language of common people. और फिर अब जो लैंग्वेज ऑफ कॉमन पीपुल है, थॉट ऑफ कॉमन पीपुल है, इमोशंस उसमें है, अब इसके बाद पोइट का क्या दायित्व है? What is the responsibility of poet? That the poet should have the ability to transmit the experience at the same accessible level. अब उस एक्सपीरियंस को पोइट जो है कि अपनी एबिलिटी के हिसाब से कॉमन मैन की लैंग्वेज यूज करके उसको एक्सेसिबल बनाता है, अर्थात समझने योग्य बनाता है कि हम उसको समझ सकें। राइट? सो द पॉइंट हियर इज that Wordsworth rejects the previous conventional approach towards literature and poetry. Then he says he speaks of poetry as existing from the poet as one person to other persons with minimal or no intermediary in it. कहने का मतलब है कि पोइट्री एक पोइट और जो भी दूसरे जो रीडर्स हैं या दूसरे लोग हैं उनके बीच में है कन्वर्स करने का एक तरीका, जिसमें कि कोई इंटरमीडिएटरी का कोई इंटरफियरेंस जो है कि एक्सेप्ट नहीं किया जा सकता, अर्थात वो दोनों ही उसको अच्छी तरह से समझें, तीसरा समझाने वाले की जरूरत नहीं पड़नी चाहिए। He recognizes some refinement of anything considered vulgar or offensive and would need revising, but otherwise no real barriers need exist. तो वो ये भी रिकग्नाइज करता है वर्ड्सवर्थ कि किसी भी चीज़ का अगर रिफाइनमेंट कर दिया गया तो वो क्या हो जाएगा, वल्गर कहता है उसको, ऑफेंसिव कहता है। कहने का मतलब कि जो जैसी है उसको वैसे ही पेश करना चाहिए, जो जैसा है। कॉमन पीपल का एक्सपीरियंस, कॉमन पीपल की लैंग्वेज है, कॉमन पीपल का एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, है ना, वो क्या सोचते हैं उसको उसी भाषा में अगर प्रेजेंट करें तो दैट इज पोइट्री। लेकिन अगर उसमें आप रिफाइनमेंट कर देते हैं तो वर्ड्सवर्थ कॉल इट्स अ वल्गर, अ क्राइम, एन ऑफेंस एंड इट नीड्स द रिवीजन। इसका रिवीजन होना चाहिए, अदरवाइज तो फिर उसके बाद में कोई रियल जो बैरियर्स हैं वो होते नहीं है। एज ए रोमांटिक वर्ड्सवर्थ वैल्यूज द हम्बल rustic ways of country folk. So as a romantic, Wordsworth gives the importance to the humbleness of common people. Rustic ways of country folk. So he talks about the rustic people, the people who are living in the countryside, about their songs, about their habits, about their talks, about their dresses, about their views, about their ideas, about their actions. This should be the subject of the poetry, Wordsworth says. People who he believes have directly experienced the truths of nature. क्योंकि वर्ड्सवर्थ ये कहता है, ये मानता है कि जो नेचर जो है, नेचर itself is truth. We also understand कि जो नेचर है वही सत्य है, और उसका जो डायरेक्ट एक्सपीरियंस अगर कोई ले रहा है तो कौन ले रहा है? Rustic people, countryside people, common people who are living in the lap of nature, amid the nature. They are the real inhabitants of nature. So they have the direct experience of the truths of nature. And therefore, their experiences can be transmitted in poetry. This is the function of the poet. What is the duty of a poet? A poet should transmit the experiences of the rustic people, common people in the poetry, which includes the same honesty, जिसके अंदर बिल्कुल ईमानदारी होनी चाहिए. उसमें कोई जब वो ट्रांसमिट करे उनके एक्सपीरियंसेस को, तो उसमें कोई बनावटीपन नहीं आना चाहिए, उसमें कुछ चेंज नहीं करना चाहिए उसको, और डायरेक्टनेस भी होनी चाहिए. सो ऑनेस्टी, यू हैव टू मार्क दिस वर्ड. Honesty and directness should be maintained by the poet while writing poetry that he finds in homogeneous rural setting, and that you know that which can only be found in rural setting, in rustic setting, in countryside setting. So the poems he creates spring from the overflow of genuine feelings. So genuine जो फीलिंग्स हैं उनका जो ओवरफ्लो है, उसमें से पोएम्स जो है कि निकलती है, बनावटीपन से नहीं, जेन्युइन फीलिंग्स से. और these lead to reflection and simple wisdom, and then are restated in ordinary language to recreate the original emotion. तो यहाँ क्या है कि Wordsworth in fact giving us a process in which poetry is created, a process in which a poem is created, a process in which original emotions are put into words. Okay, so these lead to reflection and simple wisdom. Simple wisdom चाहिए इसमें, reflections आपके याद जो भी उसको कर रहे हैं उस experiences को, और उसको आप ऑर्डिनरी लैंग्वेज, यहाँ डिक्शन बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है वर्ड्सवर्थ के मामले में. वो कहता है कि बिल्कुल कॉमन लैंग्वेज होनी चाहिए, कहीं भी उसके अंदर आर्टिफिशियल, कहीं भी उसके अंदर डिफिकल्ट लैंग्वेज और क्लासिकल लैंग्वेज इस टाइप का नहीं होना चाहिए. लैंग्वेज वही होनी चाहिए कि जो कॉमन लोगों की है, और उसमें ओरिजिनल जो इमोशंस हैं वो एक्सप्रेस किए जाने चाहिए. So the preface also rejects reliance on standards from the classical or enlightenment eras. जो मैंने आपको कहा कि he rejects the classical poetry or enlightenment era, like Pope and Johnson among the British poets. So Pope or Johnson, they are renowned, they are recognized as the classical and most enlightenment poets, writers of their time. Their language is not so easy one that anyone can understand. So here Wordsworth rejects those standards because they overlook the lives of common people. क्योंकि वो common people की जो lives है उसको तो overlook करते हैं, और common people जो बेचारे humble होते हैं, जो unadorned language में बात करते हैं, जिनकी language भी बनावटी नहीं होती, नेचुरल लैंग्वेज होती है. तो ये जो पोइट्स हैं, जो क्लासिकल पोइट्स, नियो क्लासिकल, or the intellectual poets like Pope and Johnson, their language, their poetry always overlook the lives of common people, overlook their language, overlook their humbleness, and in their poetry we have the refined as well as artificial language, and that Wordsworth rejects. Now, the second point that we have in his poetry, in his preface, that he gives us his own ideas about prose and poetry. Because most of the writers or the critics have given difference between prose and poetry. They think that prose is separate from poetry, or poetry is separate from prose. But what Wordsworth says, let's see. Devoting much attention to emphasizing the close connection of poetry with prose. So, Wordsworth supposes that there is a close connection between poetry and prose. He shows little patience for efforts in the past eras to perfect standards for either poetry or prose at the expense of the other. That is, he means to say that the poetry and prose, both of them are at the expense of other. एक दूसरे के ऊपर निर्भर हैं, आप उनको अलग नहीं कर सकते. पोइट्री और प्रोज को आप अलग नहीं कर सकते. फॉर हिम, वर्ड्सवर्थ कहता है, उसके लिए और वी कैन से अकॉर्डिंग टू वर्ड्सवर्थ, बोथ शेयर द सेम पर्पज. Wordsworth says that both poetry and prose share the same purpose. दोनों का उद्देश्य एक है. Then he says to speak plainly and honestly in language reflecting the lives of living people and not close themselves off to the other form. तो कहने का मतलब, अगर आप plainly और honestly लोगों के जीवन के बारे में रिफ्लेक्ट करते हो उस लैंग्वेज में, तो वो जो है कि किसी भी प्रोज में भी किया जा सकता है और पोइट्री में भी किया जा सकता है. उसके लिए किसी एक पर्टिकुलर फॉर्म को अडॉप्ट करना और दूसरे को रिजेक्ट करना उचित नहीं. He doesn't believe in separation of poetry and prose as two opposed approaches. So he doesn't consider that these are the two approaches. But he says that this is only a single approach. Instead, he states repeatedly they come from the same origin. कि इनका सबका एक ही उद्गम है and spirit है. So it should be accessible at equal levels. तो दोनों को हम एक ही equal level पे जो access करें, पढ़ें, देखें, समझें. He places little value on the factual or scientific in literature. अब प्रोज में क्या होता है कि जनरली जो वर्ड्सवर्थ यहाँ मेरे ख्याल से जो कहना चाह रहा है वो ये कि प्रोज में जो अदर राइटर्स हैं वो ये मान के चलते हैं कि प्रोज का मतलब है कि यू हैव द साइंटिफिक डिटेल्स, यू हैव द साइंस. और यहाँ वर्ड्सवर्थ जो कह रहा है वो कह रहा है कि वो साइंटिफिक डिटेल्स को और फैक्चुअल साइंस को लिटरेचर में कम इम्पोर्टेंस देता है. कि अगर कोई फैक्ट्स हैं और अगर साइंस है, साइंटिफिक है, तो दैट कैन नॉट टेक प्लेस प्रॉपरली इन द लिटरेचर, वेदर इट इज रिटन इन पोइट्री और इन प्रोज. जबकि जो अदर जो क्रिटिक्स हैं उन्होंने ये डिवीजन किया है कि प्रोज का मतलब है कि यू हैव द फैक्ट्स रिटन, यू हैव द साइंटिफिक डिटेल्स रिटन, एंड पोइट्री इज समथिंग which is in verse, which has certain meters, certain rhythm, certain pattern, and talks about the emotions, not about the facts. तो यहाँ वर्ड्सवर्थ इस चीज़ को भी थोड़ा एक्सेप्ट करता है कि साइंटिफिक और फैक्चुअल जो डिटेल है वो लिटरेचर में एक्सेप्टेबल नहीं. He is far more interested in the emotions. This is the point. Wordsworth is interested in the emotions arising from an immediate experience, जो कि experience से निकलते हैं emotions, that is later reflected upon, assimilated and understood. तो कोई भी experience से जो इमोशंस निकलते हैं, बाद में उनके ऊपर हम रिफ्लेक्ट करते हैं, फिर उनको असिमुलेट करते हैं, उनको हम जो है कि स्वीकार करते हैं, उनको ग्रहण करते हैं, अनुपालन करते हैं, फिर उनको समझते हैं, और ये करके देन वी और देन द पोइट, व्हाट डज द पोइट डू? द पोइट ट्रांसमिट्स दोज एक्सपीरियंसेस इन कॉमन मैन्स लैंग्वेज इनटू पोइट्री. So he can see the significance of scientific enquiry and knowledge, but for speaking the truths of the lives of his contemporaries, he keeps a distance between instinctive literature and applied scientific literature. तो जहाँ कॉमन मैन के ट्रूथ को आप अगर देख करके और उनके बारे में बोल रहे हैं, then you have come to the poetry. और जब आप कोई applied scientific literature जो है कि फिर वो अलग हो जाएगा, क्योंकि अगर आप कोई इंक्वायरी नॉलेज के बारे में साइंटिफिक इंक्वायरी कर रहे हैं तो दैट विल बी द एप्लाइड साइंटिफिक लिटरेचर. फॉर वर्ड्सवर्थ दिस टाइप ऑफ लिटरेचर डज नॉट यूनाइट द साइंटिस्ट विद ऑर्डिनरी पीपल, क्योंकि जो इंक्वायरी आप कर रहे हैं साइंस की या कोई नॉलेज की, तो वो लिटरेचर दैट वुड नॉट अट्रैक्ट द ऑर्डिनरी पीपल, दैट लिटरेचर वुड नॉट हैव द ordinary people's language on their daily basis, but instead keeps him isolated in a world of facts. जबकि उस कहने का मतलब कि उस लिटरेचर में कॉमन मैन का कोई डिस्क्रिप्शन नहीं होगा, वो बिल्कुल वर्ल्ड ऑफ जो फैक्ट्स है उससे आइसोलेटेड रहेगा और रहता भी. इसलिए अगर फैक्ट्स का डिस्क्रिप्शन है, अगर कोई नॉलेज की इंक्वायरी है, एंड इफ दैट इज रिटन in either prose or in poetry, that will be the applied scientific literature, and it does not have the emotions, it does not attract the ordinary people or the readers, it does not have the description about the ordinary people on a daily basis. Okay, writing as he was in the first year of 1800s, he could not anticipate the enormous role scientific research and experimentation has assumed since then. The preface uses in a new world of literary sensibility and is focused ahead of that changing world. However, scientifically, it seems naive. So, another important thing is that is the sensibility, and which is only found in literature. So dear friends, this is what from me for today for you. So far the preface written by William Wordsworth is concerned. One more lecture or the next lecture that will be also on the preface, and then we will finish this topic. I hope you will enjoy it and you will understand as well. If you have any queries regarding it, you may come to college by 18th January and you can ask me, meet me there. Thank you very much.